Thank you guys so much for being here. We are here to learn from Nelson Bird today, which I'm super excited about. So my name is Sarah. I'm the program manager for the Growing Indigenous Storytellers Fellowship, which is a program that is in partnership with APTN News and the Indigenous Journalists Association. I'm pleased to be representing Journalists for Human Rights today, and just want to thank everybody for coming. In terms of housekeeping, so we're going to have about 35 minutes of presentation of Nelson sharing with us, and then we'll move into a Q&A portion. We're going to do probably about 10 minutes of Q&A, and just so you guys know, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube, including the Q&A portion. If you don't want to raise your hand and voice your question yourself when the Q&A period comes up, please feel free to drop it in the chat and I will read it out. And so without further ado, I will intro Nelson Bird, who's a former CTV journalist and current lecturer at the First Nations University of Canada, originally from the Peepeekisis Cree First Nation. No, I messed that up. Originally from the Peepeekisis Cree First Nation in Saskatchewan, Nelson spent 26 years with CTV Regina, working as a reporter, camera person, anchor, host, producer, and assignment editor. So like pretty much everything. Nelson has always used his platform to amplify Indigenous voices and bring attention to the challenges and achievements of First Nations communities. So without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and hello to everybody who's joined. It's a pleasure for me to be speaking to you today on this beautiful Monday, Tuesday. What is it? Thursday. It's Thursday at noon here in Saskatchewan right now. In case you're wondering what time it is here, it's lunchtime. So I came home from an event I was at with my students at the university. So I came home for a couple hours to do this. I'm at home, not in my office at the university, which is, by the way, a very beautiful building. If you ever get a chance to come to Regina, make sure you contact me and you'll get a tour of our First Nations University, which, in my opinion, is probably the most beautiful building in Saskatchewan, in this province, and maybe Western Canada. Just the way it's shaped and the energy from it, it's shaped in a circle. It's shaped. It's all round. It's all curves. Anyways, that aside, I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about media, reconciliation, perceptions, truths, and myths. And storytelling. Of course, it all stems from storytelling. My career spans over 30 years as a student journalist to a professional journalist to now to a lecturer. And I'm going to tell you some stories because that's what I am. I'm a storyteller. I'm an assignment editor, a journalist, of course, which is kind of all tied in together. And I think I want to start with something. I spoke to an audience last week, government employees, about 800 people. And I do this presentation many times over. And sometimes it shocks. There's going to be a little bit of shocking factors, a little bit of sadness, a little bit of humor, maybe more humor than not. And several emotions that come to people's minds and their hearts as I talk. But about 15 years ago, somebody invited me, my friend Tyrone, who works at Saskatchewan Heritage Park in Saskatoon in the archive department. I was already into my maybe 7th year as a broadcaster journalist, and he knew who I was, and he wanted to show me something. He wanted to show me a media written piece by the Saskatoon Star Phoenix that was dated to the 1950s. And the reason he wanted me to see it is to remind us as journalists where we were, who we are, where we come from, and how society viewed us, especially the journalists, the white journalists. So there was a headline in this newspaper, and the headline was, "Chiefs from across Saskatchewan gather in Saskatoon." That was the headline. The first sentence that he asked me to read, I read it out loud for him. He said, "Just read it out loud." So the first sentence was, "Chiefs from across Saskatchewan are gathering in Saskatoon, and some of them even brought their squaws." Period. I was shocked. I was speechless. I said, "This is how they used to view us. This is how journalists used to write about us," and nobody gave it a second thought. Of course, this was in the 50s, prior to our Indigenous people, our ancestors, even having any kind of freedom of the press wasn't even imagined. My parents were, in their 30s and the 50s, and they couldn't vote. They weren't considered Canadian citizens. So we've come so far from that generation to where we were at my point in my career to where we are today. Have we come a long ways? I say, yeah, we have. We've come a long ways, but at the same time, there's still a ways to go. So I started my career in journalism. Well, yeah, I started First Nations University, it was SIFC at the time, Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, back in the mid 90s. Prior to that, I was actually a tradesperson. I was a building maintenance, air conditioning engineer at one of our technical colleges here, and I did that for 7 years. And I realized then, this was in the 80s to early 90s, 1991, that it's not what I want to do. I don't think this is going to really achieve the goals I want in life, which I didn't know, which my fate and my destiny led me to what I do today. So what happened was I started university in the 1992. I came across this program called it was Indian Communication Arts Program, which is where I am teaching now. I've sort of come full circle. And that was over 30 years ago that I entered that course, which led me into a program called the School of Journalism at the University of Regina. So I combined several educational departments, Inca, School of Journalism, and a degree in Indigenous Studies, Indian Studies. I say Indian because a lot of my career was using the term Indian. It was even in all the titles and all the government pamphlets and universities. So even growing up, on the reserve, I grew up on Peepeekisis, by the way, till I was about 17 years old. And I left there with my parents back then, and partially because of a tragedy that happened in our house. And I think it was once again and it's tragic as it was. It led us to our trajectories in life. Some of my siblings, we all went our own directions eventually with our careers and lives. Some went down some addictions paths and crime, and others stayed on an education path. My older brother came home when I was 13 years old on the reserve, and he shot himself in our basement. And he lived. He did live, but it really changed a lot of the things that my mom decided. I think we got to leave this reserve. So it took a few years. Eventually, we did leave and we moved to the city. And it was then that I ended up in the trade that I was in. I kind of fell into that too. It wasn't something I really planned, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it while I did it. Then jumping ahead to university and the School of Journalism is where we had to do internships. And an event happened in May of 1996, 29 years ago, this month, maybe this day. I don't know, I forget the exact date, but I was about 3 or 4 weeks into my internship where an event happened that solidified my place as a broadcast journalist, TV journalist. And what happened was, and this is a really odd, funny story, it was that when you're an intern, as you know, in your careers, if you're ever an intern, you're usually given the things that other people don't want to do, just to learn. You send Nelson with that camera person, send Nelson with this person. So I was going with people all over the place, learning, but never really doing anything serious, as is normal, because I was a news manager too. So I know interns and what their role is. So this one day on a Monday, I was asked to go to a pet store and interview a parrot, of all things. So I get in the car with my camera person, and we go to the pet store. What happened was a woman in Victoria bought a parrot. My internship was in Victoria, BC, by the way, check TV. So I bought this item. She bought a parrot for her 4-year-old son. Parrot was like 7 years old. The parrot not only said hello, it said, "What the fuck?" And it said that, and it started to swear. And the woman said, "I don't want my little boy learning how to swear from a parrot." So she tried to get the money back from the other lady. The other lady says, "No, you bought as is." You know that phrase, you bought as is. So meanwhile, she didn't want the parrot in her house. The other lady didn't want the parrot. She took it to a pet store and left it there while the legal fight ensued. So that Monday, I had to go to the pet store and see this parrot and try and make it talk, swear. So I was in the pet store with my cameraman, and I'm at the cage, interviewing the parrot, trying to, and saying what the fuck, and it would just sit there and look at me, and I think I felt bad for the parrot, but it wouldn't swear. So we had cell phones back then too, but they were those big black things, and I called our boss when I got back to the car, the van, and I says, the parrot Susie, her name is Susie, she's not swearing. What should I do? She said, well, come back soon, come back. And then just as I hung up the phone, we have police scanners in our vehicles, which pick up all the chatter between the police and what's going on. And the police scanner said, a missile just landed in View Royale, suburb of Victoria. And that's where we were. We were in View Royale. And they gave the address, and we were like 2 blocks away from this house. And a missile, how can that be? A rocket? So we drove to this house quickly as we could. We got there before the police and the fire. What happened was there's an army base in Victoria called the Esquimalt. Somebody pushed a button on one of those ships, and this rocket went into the sky. It pushed the wrong button, and instead of this thing disintegrating, it actually was a solid metal 8 foot rocket missile looking thing about this much in circumference with the fins on the end. It was sticking out of the ground when we got there. It went through the garage to the side of the house, and we saw it. So what the hell is this? And so in our field, we shoot first and we ask questions later. So we got all the shots we could, and I interviewed the man who was in the backyard, and he says, I was just sitting here working on my boat, and all of a sudden I heard this noise, and it came through there, and the cat almost hit the cat. The cat's okay. No one was hurt. So like seconds later, the police showed up, fire, everybody cordoned off a couple houses away, and things happened so quickly that morning, that the whole communication team from the army was like so fast. The police, the fire, the emergency was so quick at getting everything together that by the time the police got there, they knew it was a dud. It's called a dud, which means there's no explosive, of course. So they knew that, and they just kind of hung around. It was no shock or intensity because they knew it was not going to explode. But still, it was a heck of a story. So we got the shots. I called the newsroom, and I told them what I just told you, what happened. And they were amazed. I- if you work in a newsroom, those are the events, the unplanned events that just make the day. It's the adrenaline rush going through everybody at that moment was intense, including me, especially me as an intern. I was quite young. I wasn't, like I said, I started school a little later in life. I was still in my mid to late 20s. And all of a sudden, news manager says to me, okay, Nelson, you're going live at noon. Live? I was just interviewing a parrot. Says, yeah, you're going to go live at noon, and we're going to get the tape. Of course, we had tapes. We don't have, like nowadays, we can send footage back with a phone, like in seconds. It's there. It's going to be on the air right away. Social media. It's going to be on a website. That's now. Then it was noon cast, 6 o'clock cast, late night cast. So we put the tape in a taxi cab, and we sent it back to the station. They cut the video for noon. The video was on at noon, and then I had my camera. I went live at noon, explaining what happened that day, what happened that morning, just what I knew from my perspective in my interview. Full hour later, after the cast, everything was like the army was talking, the army base, the people were talking, the neighbors were talking. We had all this in one day. So I led the newscast that day at 6 o'clock, from going to interview a parrot to having the lead story on this incident. Luckily, nobody was hurt or injured. And then that day, they kind of viewed me a little differently. They viewed me like, hey, he knows what he's doing. He can do the job. And I did. And I fell in love with TV shortly after that. I love being out there in the communities. I love interviewing people, seeing, because television reporting is so visual. I am now 30 years, almost 30, well, I guess 30 years as a journalist, but 29 years as a television intern, always thinking visual, always seeing things, but telling the story at the same time. So I finished my degree, and I got a job at CTV Regina shortly after. It took a while because in 1997, I graduated. My girlfriend, my wife now, both of us were applying for jobs everywhere. The industry was a lot different then. Nobody was hiring Indigenous people. It seemed like nobody wanted us. So I was applying everywhere I could. And something happened around 1998. people were saying we better get on this Indigenous bandwagon and start hiring and showing this culture in a more positive light. Because prior to this, a lot of times when we saw Indigenous people on TV or newspapers, it was always like there was always those things where it's dead, drunk. I forget all those different ones, but it's usually sometimes the victim, usually the suspect, usually the court stories. It was always those kinds of kind of like not good stories. Very few times we'd ever see a regular Indigenous person doing things that were not just traditional. Because a lot of times it had to be dancing, there has to be drumming involved, or court. It just seemed to be that. So it was time that Canadians started to see Indigenous people in a new light. And my timing going into CTV Regina in 1998 was pretty special because they seeked me out. In 1998, I got a call in July from the news manager at CTV Regina. They were needing a host of a television show called Indigenous Circle, which is a half-hour show that aired on Sundays. And the show had originally aired for like 5 years before that with various hosts, but they never had a full-time position, someone dedicated to that show. But they also needed somebody who was a journalist. They wanted someone who was a journalist, and they wanted someone who could be a video journalist, meaning I would do the camera work, the editing, the shooting, everything, going to all the stories and researching that. That part was a little daunting. They called me up. I went in for an interview, and I was offered the job basically that same day, based on my experience. It wasn't just because I was Indigenous, and not just because of that, because people may say, "Oh, he's only hired because he's Indigenous." Well, I was qualified, experienced to a point, of course, as a student and as an intern. And then I went right into it. I spent 15 full years as a video journalist at CTV Regina, Indigenous Circle. I was a news reporter, I was an editor, I was a camera person, I was an anchor for all those years. And I remember when I first started being on TV, even before I started CTV, I was at a funeral on my reserve. My uncles used to always tease me and joke with me and have fun. The humor is always there all the time. That's the best part. Our culture, I think, is our humor. And I told him, I said, Uncle, he said, what are you doing now, Nelson? He said to me, I said, well, Uncle, I'm going to be on TV. And he looks at me and he says, good, now I can turn you off. And he does that little thing with his hand. And we laughed and we laughed. And that joke turned out to be a lifelong joke as long as he was alive, because every time we'd see him in the same room with him, and he'd always say, still on TV? Good, I can turn you off, he'd say to me. And we'd laugh. Um, so that was part of the humor that I get to is that I was able to share our stories. I'd be able to travel Saskatchewan, Canada, the United States, and overseas 4 times, focusing on a lot of Indigenous veteran stories. So I got to help them share their stories. It was never about me being on TV. It was about me being able to tell their stories for such a long time. I became very trusted as a journalist, as a person that people could trust. So I'd go into people's houses, I'd go to reserves, almost every reserve in this province. I would visit there, do a story on maybe the school, maybe an elder's profile, maybe that would be a lot of my time. But I'd also, between seasons, because Indigenous Circle only aired from September until May, like a typical TV season. Those are other times that I would be doing news, working as a news reporter, going to crashes, fires, all these things, filling in as a news anchor, and researching and doing a lot of specials. I did a lot of if you Google, not Google, if you YouTube my name, Nelson Bird, video, Nelson Bird subscription. I have a subscription. I think it's, yeah. I s- I have, you can subscribe to my name there, and there's like 20 videos there that are just 20 of the video specials that I've done. And they range from traditional medicines. I spent a whole summer traveling. We went to New York State, Ontario, northern Saskatchewan, doing stories about traditional medicines and who uses it and what's it used for. Some examples, talking to Indigenous people from all over the place, even non-Indigenous, about how traditional medicines can be incorporated into modern medicine. So we would research all these stories a lot ahead of time, go and shoot them, and then spend a few months writing them and editing them. So that was my life for 15 straight years, and I loved it so much. Physically, it was hard. Mentally, it was hard. Emotionally, it was hard. Spiritually, it had its challenges too. Um, Spiritually, when I talk about that, I mean, what happens is, well, I'll back up before I go to that. I guess there were challenges in the fact that as an Indigenous journalist, being one of the only ones in Western Canada, when I started out, I was the only Indigenous employee at CTV News, period. In 1998, a few more came along, and we had a mentorship program where many young people have come to work with me, including Chris Najikoti, who's now at APTN, my good friend, and he's always still around in my life all the time. Um, but I found that I felt I was always the only Indian in the room. Now, if that phrase sounds familiar or it doesn't, it is a fact for many people who are professionals and career minded. We find that we have to go into rooms and not be ashamed of who we are. Never. I was never ashamed of who I am as an Indigenous person. Never. My mom taught me not to be ashamed, but to keep working hard, keep that work ethic strong, share who we are as Indigenous people, who I perceive myself as an Indigenous person. Because when I left the reserve and I started to work in the out there in the field, in the whatever field I was working in, a lot of times it was my own people, relatives, friends, family I grew up with that were saying I'm less than because I'm now I have a car. I remember I went back to my reserve once to a party, and people were kind of making fun of me because, oh, there's Nelson, he's a white man now. So why do you say that? Well, you have a car and you have a job. That doesn't mean that doesn't that's not that's a bad definition. That does not mean that at all. I'm an Indian wherever I am, whatever I do in life. And more recently, I was at a reserve gas station, my own too, and someone said to me in a very sarcastic tone, "Oh, there's Nelson Bird, the lucky one." And I said to him, "So why lucky? So why am I lucky?" So, because you're on TV and you have that job and you have a house, bought a house. I said, that's not luck. I told him, that's not luck. I didn't win that. I didn't win that. Luck is going to the bingo at the casino. That's luck. This was hard work, ambition, determination, and being taught that it's okay to still be who you are, but work hard. And my parents taught me that, and my siblings too. Um, but then when I got into the newsroom, there was a lot of times where viewers, because thousands of people would see me on TV each week, people would dislike me simply because I was Indian. They'd see me on TV, they'd call, they'd leave messages, they would write this. This was the early 90s before social media, of course. So I would get letters and cards from people and viewers saying, a lot of hate, some death threats, a lot of hate, a lot of racist calls. One of them I remember saying, "It's going to be a race war, and all you Indians are going to die, and you're going to be the first." One or two sentences in a letter, no sign, and I can always tell these letters. I kept many of them somewhere. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't. Anyways, I've kept those letters, but I can always tell a person's writing just by I can look at a letter. I learned to look at a letter and know, oh, it's going to be from an old racist white guy. I just know. And sure enough, we don't like you. Just go back to the reserve. And all these things had happened over the years, even death threats over the phone. I'd be away from work, and so in the middle of the night, I'd get these messages on my voicemail on my desk phone. Bad, really terrible things they'd say to me. Some of these things were investigated, some were just shrugged off by my managers. It really used to bother me a lot because I was getting these racist, hate-filled letters a lot of times and phone calls, and they'd be like, "Oh, at least people are watching. At least they're watching." That was the attitude of one person. But eventually it was investigated. And it was really unfair because we had a blonde white woman who would change her hairstyles sometimes, and she'd get a phone call or a letter. "We hate your hair. We hate your hair. You shouldn't have changed it. You're a damn bitch." All of a sudden, oh my God, we got to do something. We got to contact this person. We have to cease and desist because they said that to her about her hair. There was much more panic when it came to her than me. But I kept on going. I never stopped. I didn't let these things get to me because I knew I had a mission, that my mission, my purpose in life was to continue to tell these stories of our people. And I still, to this day, I'm on that mission. In 2013, I left being a full-time uh, reporter, camera person, editor, and show host. I left in 2013 because I think I just had enough. 15 years was enough of doing the same thing. I felt it was time to pass on that torch. And Chris Chakotay was working with us. He was an intern also. He was following in my footsteps in a major way. He used to watch me on TV when he was a kid, and he used to say, "Someday I'm going to have that job, Nelson's." And sure enough, it happened. It was meant to be. So he and I worked together on many specials. So when in 2013 a position came open that in the newsroom as a newsroom assignment editor, assignment manager, basically, which is really prestigious for most people. Most newsrooms has that person, and I applied and I got the job because it was time. And I was very likely the very first Indigenous person in Canada to be in a position of assignment manager in a mainstream newsroom. And I kept that job for 10 years until I moved on to the university. But I remember when I was in I first left TV and I wasn't on for like months and months. So people were like, "Where's Nelson?" And Creason had filled in for me, which was great. It just seemed so natural. And I was at another event. It was a wedding this time, and one of my uncles, a different uncle, his brother, said, "Nelson, I don't see you on TV anymore. What's going on? Are you still CTV?" I says, "Yes, yes, I am, Uncle. I'm on CTV, but now I'm an assignment editor." And he wasn't impressed. I could tell he was like, "Okay, what is that?" So while I go in every morning, early in the morning, and I research stories and I assign them, I see what's going on all out in the city and everything else, and now that's my job. I kind of oversee the news. And I could tell he wasn't impressed. So, and I boss white people around all day, I said to him, and he went, "Oh my God." He was so happy. That joy in his face when I said that. And he called his wife over, "Bertha, guess what Nelson does? He bosses the white people around all day." And she said, "Oh my boy, we're so proud." And it hit me then, that day, that these people who were born in the 30s and 40s went to residential school. They went through that system that we're all aware of, the trauma, the residential school being taken away. They worked hard, they were educated, and they had jobs throughout their lives, but they could never see. They never thought from where they were and what they did that they would see a young man like myself. Well, I wasn't that young. I was over 40, uh, in the position to boss white people around all day, and that just brought them joy, and it brought me joy too, because I was in charge of around 12 to 15 people on a daily basis, telling them what their stories were, what they should do, and how they should do the stories. So I did that for 15 years. I mean, not 15, about 12 years, I should say. And then it was time. It was time. It was time for me to basically move on. This was all during the times of the TRC, the calls to action were all being brought in. So I was very, very well aware of what was happening in society when it came to reconciliation and those calls to action. I actually sat in on a few of the CRC commissioners' hearings. They had one in Regina here, and I went there one day and I just sat and listened to some of the stories, and it broke my heart. It broke my heart, especially knowing that my parents, my grandparents, all my uncles and aunts, every single one of them went to residential school. And I never really knew of their stories or their trauma. Many had passed away by the time I started hearing the stories, and they never talked about it. It was hush hush. We knew it wasn't good. We didn't know it was that bad. So I started to hear these stories, and it impacted me emotionally a lot, and increasing also. And I'll speak for him a little bit because he and I both have went through so many stories together. That emotional impact, that baggage that we had to carry around with us. We spent the whole summer on suicides, the epidemic of suicides, and we traveled listening to stories, reporting on them, writing them, listening over and over and again. And the reason we did that was because it's an epidemic. And I've been to groups and I've spoken to groups, and I've said to people, "How many people here have been impacted by suicide?" Every single person hand usually goes up if I'm in a room full of Indigenous people. Everyone. So I knew that this epidemic needs to be addressed. It needs to be talked about. It needs to be spoken to. So we did that with that purpose, and not just to exploit it, but to try and address it in a way that would prevent more. Hasn't really changed. It's still out there, still somewhat of an epidemic, but we keep on the fight. And that's our role as journalists, as Indigenous journalists. I find I can do the stories. I can go to the fires. I can go to the stabbings. I can go to the court stories and all those things. And the courts wasn't my thing as much. I went to many court stories. And I know I only got a few minutes here, but I'll close quickly with a funny story here. Um, because I live Regina is quite a small city, and I have a lot of cousins and relatives in this city who go to court, who are in the court, who may be on the other side of the bench, in that Holden area. And one time, it was a very serious charge. It wasn't a death, but it was something serious. And my cousin was on the stand, and I tried not to make too much eye contact because I'm working as a reporter. I'm like, okay, I'm going to be professional. I'm not going to. All of a sudden, our eyes caught, and he goes, waves at me and call me. He says like that. And every reporter looks at me. You know him? I said, yeah, yeah, it's my cousin. And of course what can I say? I'm reporting on the stories. Another time I was in the courthouse and there was this First Nation lady from my reserve on the stand. And the prosecutor asked her, so what happened at 5 o'clock? And she said, well, we're all at this house, we're having a barbecue, and all of a sudden this big old res bomb showed up and all these Indians piled out. And the judge and everybody kind of goes, and I'm giggling. And the prosecutor asks, could you explain what a res bomb is? And she says, yeah, it's a big old brown, dirty res car. And we all laughed so hard. And we couldn't stop laughing because it was all this Indigenous people sitting there watching. And the judge was like, quiet, everybody quiet. And of course, you get that giggles and you couldn't. But it was a serious story too that turned oddly funny. But my career in journalism is not over now. I teach students. I'm at the First Nations University Indigenous Communication Arts program. I teach multimedia. I teach broadcast. I teach radio. A little bit of podcast, which I'm learning about. I learned lots about social media, which is a whole. If I had another hour, I could talk about some of the social media pros and cons that I've experienced. But Indigenous Circle on Facebook there's a group called Indigenous Circle. You can join that if you want to. It has 12,000 followers. And basically, we put stories in there. I don't put stories anymore as much as some of the newer staff does because I don't do stories anymore. I teach, and I teach about reconciliation, all those things. I do a lot of everything. But you know what? I see it's 12:36. I should open it up for some questions now. I could go on and on.
That was excellent, Nelson. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask? If you don't want to voice your question, I'll say again, just drop it in the chat and I will read it out.
Okay, journalists.
Yeah, maybe I can get us going. So you have this career, you have this breadth of experience, and you talked a little about how you kind of came into the industry and some of the things that you encountered. What's your advice for your students? What's your advice for Indigenous folks who are kind of just getting started in journalism?
Good question. I have a lot of young journalists right now in my class, and in fact, today I'm with some not job shop. We're at a trade fair, and just yesterday we were sitting in a room, and a couple of young people asked me questions about, how do you get a story? How do you actually approach people when you're not 100% sure on what to ask or what to do? There's several methods, and we created. Um, I think there's different styles. Everybody has their own ways of doing things, and with CBC, we had somebody from CBC teaching the students last week, and he was teaching them to do these pre-interviews that were like two hours long, and then spend a day making a storyboard, and then writing it, and then doing the interview. That's like forever. In mainstream news, whether it's for a newspaper, whether it's for say CTV or Global, or it's now. News is now. News is new. So you got to be really quick to go with the flow as quickly as you can and turn on a dime. Be ready for that. Don't expect that there's going to be a lot of time for you to spend, do a pre-interview, take some notes, and then do the interview tomorrow. No, 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 no. That's some people can do that. The vast majority of news that you see, whether it's American news, I'll give you an example. Uh, if you have KTLA, which is a Los Angeles news station, they are so fast. Things just happen, 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 happen. So these reporters have to be on the ball all the time and turn. Like that swearing parrot story, Susie. I had to switch on a dime to that story and adjust my mindset and my focus to that. Not thinking about what's happening with the parrot. That'll wait for another day. I have to focus on what I'm doing right now. And assignment editors, which I was, it's up to their job to make sure that you are prepared enough to go out and do that story. So as a manager, it's up to us too, as managers, to be able to prepare you, especially as a new reporter, as a young reporter, Indigenous or not. Because I don't really view people in the sense that you're an Indigenous reporter. You are a reporter who is Indigenous. That's how I see it, even though I may say Indigenous reporter often. But I see it as we are people, we are who we are, who is an Indigenous person here. When I first started at CTV, I was always introduced as the Aboriginal reporter. Everybody was Aboriginal reporter, Aboriginal reporter. Even the staff list, everybody was reporter. Nelson Bird, Aboriginal reporter. Like, what the hell? Why don't you put Ukrainian reporter? Why don't you put white guy, middle-aged, woman reporter? It was just me for a long time, and I brought it up to the managers too, and we never even thought of that. We have to educate others as we go along. Certain phrases that I've heard too many times in my life that I've spoken up about. The one that we've heard. Hey, let's have a powwow. We need to have a powwow. A saleswoman came into our newsroom recently, and she says, "Oh, Carl, we need to have a powwow in a few minutes here." And I jumped up off my chair and said, "Powwow, okay, I'll be right there." And she looked at me and said, "No, not you. Well, you said it's a powwow. Those are for everybody. Those are for everybody. And they're dancing. They're going to be dancing? Drums? No, it's a meeting." So, well, it's not a powwow. Get your facts straight, I told her. And she was like, And then, you know what? Sometimes it may piss them off. It may shock them when I say things like that. But she probably remembered that for a long, long time to this day. Otherwise, I would just sit there cowering, like, "Oh, I don't like that she said that." No, I'm to the point now where I'll call it out as is because I've seen too many things. But I just I have some students right now who are so shy, so quiet. They're like just peep, and they're young people, and I'm very patient with them. Very patient. I'm never going to get angry with them. If they're shy, I find what their strengths are. I'll take them aside and I'll talk to them and say, "What do you like? Like, what kind of music do you like?" Just to make that small talk, just to make them feel comfortable that I am a human too, and I do understand where they're coming from, especially as an Indigenous person. They look up to me as an uncle or grandpa, maybe. You're getting old when people come up to me now and back then they used to say, "I watch you on TV all the time." Back then, now it's like, "I used to watch you when I was a kid," or "My grandpa watches you." And you're at that age where, well, I'm up there. So I'm 60 years old now, and I feel I've done a lot and I can talk a lot.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for that answer. Are there any questions from the audience? So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us here today. We are so glad to be learning from Nelson Bird. If you have any feedback, please send it to canadian.programs@jhr.ca, and I will drop that in the chat here. And please stay tuned on social media, both JHRs and the IJAs, for more in this series. We're going to be continuing throughout the year, wrapping up in December, and we would love to see you again. Thanks so much.